So after July of 41, while Japan is preparing to attack the United States, Japan and Japanese and U.S. diplomats are negotiating, and there's three key issues. Some of them were not that difficult. The U.S. wants Japan to pull out of the pact with Italy and Germany, which wasn't really that big a deal. The U.S. demanded that Japan withdraw from southern Indochina, the area that, what's now present-day Vietnam. And then the U.S. wants Japan to withdraw from Vietnam. So these other two are major, major sticking points, especially the idea of withdrawing from China. By 1941, simply put, Japan was too deep into China to withdraw from China. It had made huge sacrifices in China in terms of finance, in terms of military costs, and in terms of lives lost, Japanese lives lost. Of course, the Japanese didn't care about the Chinese that they killed. And so for Japan, it was just a non-starter to pull completely out of China. They were willing to kind of negotiate, maybe to give up some of the territories that they had captured after 37. But the idea of pulling out completely out of China, especially the Manchuria area, that was just not going to happen from the Japanese point of view. It was impossible. Even if someone had agreed to that, they would have been assassinated by elements of the Japanese army and navy. It was just never, ever going to happen. Also, from the point of view of the Japanese, they just can't pull out of Manchuria because it's just too important, not only for natural resources, which I've talked a lot about, but also because of its location. Because Japan controls Korea, right? You pull out of Manchuria, then Japan's control over Korea becomes very, very shaky. And Japan was extremely worried about Korea being controlled by a third party, i.e., the Soviet Union. And again, without being an apologist for Japan, I'm actually very, very critical of Japan during World War II. And I think Japan, in many ways, has kind of gotten off the hook for the barbarism that it practiced during World War II, the tens of millions of lives that were lost because of the Japanese. So I'm not at all sympathetic to the Japanese, but you have to admit, thinking about Korea today, North Korea and the threat, you can kind of understand where Japan was coming from without being apologists for Japan. So Japan is like, there's just no way we're leaving Manchuria because it would expose, besides the natural resources that Manchuria has in the land, it would expose Korea to take over by a third party, especially the Soviet Union. So negotiations continue. They continue in good faith, but by October of 1941, the Japanese have concluded that war isn't unavoidable. It's necessary. That they've got to fight, or from their point of view, they have to commit suicide. They can't pull out of Manchuria, and that's a non-negotiable position from the point of view of the U.S. The U.S. won't negotiate, won't start selling Japan oil unless it pulls out of what today is Vietnam, or if it pulls and Manchuria. So war was a lesser evil from the point of view of the Japanese. The other thing about the Japanese, they have to move quickly. The Japanese had stockpiled oil, so they did have probably over a year's supply of oil in their stockpiles, but they couldn't mess around. They needed to make a decision. Was it going to be war or not? Because they had some oil stockpiled, but still a decision had to be made very quickly. And so the Japanese decided that they needed to go to war. So what the Japanese do is they've made plans. Yamamoto, the Japanese admiral that's later killed, you read about it in Monday. He is given command of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor is a naval base near Honolulu, Hawaii. It's a significant naval base. It held over 8 battleships, 300 airplanes that were destroyed at Pearl Harbor. So Pearl Harbor has a number of airplanes, it has a number of battleships, it has a number of aircraft carriers, and it's a pretty easy target from the point of view of the Japanese because Pearl Harbor is really not that well defended. The other thing about Pearl Harbor was U.S. racism got in the way. Uh, Post 9/11, you might remember there was this saying, connect the dots, that U.S. intelligence had not been able to connect the dots to lead to the terrorists that bombed the Pentagon and the trade towers and took over the plane that those passengers so courageously crashed into the field in Pennsylvania. Um, the same thing happened in the U.S. vis-a-vis Japan. American policymakers just did not believe that Japan had the capacity to bomb the U.S. There were even these racist ideas that the shape of the almond shape of Japanese eyes prevented them from being good pilots. I mean, just ridiculous things like that. Long story short, U.S. military completely underestimated the capacity of the Japanese Navy to mount this kind of attack. So Pearl Harbor is about 4,000 miles from Japan. It's virtually undefended. U.S. intelligence is getting some signs that Japan is about to go to war in December of 1940. But what U.S. intelligence thinks is that Japan is going to attack either the Philippines, it's going to attack the Dutch East Indies, it's going to attack Singapore, which of course it will do ultimately. But the, so the U.S. government's expecting a Japanese attack, but they just don't see it happening at Pearl Harbor. We just don't see it happening at Pearl Harbor. Um, and so what happens is that the J- Japan wants to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet that's stationed deployed to Pearl Harbor, and the idea is that destroy the Pacific Fleet. Japan can occupy the Dutch East Indies, continue their occupation of Vietnam, move into Singapore, move into the Philippines, move into other areas of Southeast Asia. And then what the Japanese will do, they'll force the United States to the negotiating table. This is the plan. You know, Japan never considered invading the United States or anything of the sort. Japan never thought it could defeat the United States in the sense of conquest. But what Japan did believe is that it could force the United States to the negotiating table, especially if the Pacific Fleet was destroyed. And then Japan could extract concessions from the United States, and also Japan didn't necessarily need oil from the U.S. because it had captured the Dutch East Indies. So that's one of the things that's really important. Japan never thought it would conquer the United States or anything like that. It just thought it could force the United States to accept the Japanese expansion into Southeast Asia. So on December 7th, the Japanese who had been practicing an attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Air Force, which was one of the best air forces in the world this time, had practiced with shallow water torpedoes. Um, um, the harbor, Pearl Harbor, is not very deep. And so the Japanese were very well practiced. They caught the Americans completely by surprise. And in less than 2 hours on December 7th, every battleship in Pearl Harbor had sustained significant damage. But, and this is often forgotten, um, of the battleships that were sunk at Pearl Harbor, all but two were eventually salvaged and repaired. The two that weren't were, of course, the USS Arizona and the USS Utah. So even though the U.S. suffered tremendous losses of its battleships, these battleships, in part because the harbor was so shallow, lived again to fight another day. But the more important aspect of the Japanese and the failure of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor is the great prize of Pearl Harbor were the aircraft carriers. Aircraft carriers are floating Air Force bases. And that was the great prize of the Japanese. But luckily for the United States, all the significant aircraft carriers that were stationed in Pearl Harbor were out at sea. They were out at sea. They were away from Pearl Harbor on December 7th. Some were on maneuvers. Some had returned to the mainland. Some were delivering planes and troops to American positions at Midway and Wake Island. So the U.S. got hugely lucky at Pearl Harbor in the fact that its aircraft carriers were not destroyed. In addition, the Japanese didn't launch another attack that would have destroyed the oil at Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor oil had to be shipped to Pearl Harbor from California. And if the Japanese had destroyed the oil deposits in Pearl Harbor that were stacked there, that would have delayed the U.S. response for months and months because it would have taken a while for the U.S. to resupply Pearl Harbor with oil. But that wasn't something that the U.S. had to worry about after Pearl Harbor because the Japanese were kind of happy with what they had done. And so they pulled back their forces, and they didn't do nearly as much damage as they could have done, especially if they had launched other attacks as were planned. Also, the repair shops, the shipyards, the submarine docks were not really hurt that badly in the attack. So what happens is, as bad as Pearl Harbor is, 2,400 of our men were killed at Pearl Harbor. It was horrific in that sense, but as bad as Pearl Harbor was, it could have been so much worse than it was. So you can argue that Pearl Harbor, from the Japanese point of view, was a tactical victory, but strategically, I wouldn't say it's a defeat, but it's certainly a draw. Most importantly, what Pearl Harbor did was infuriated the United States. The United States, no U.S. politician could negotiate with Japan after a surprise attack like that. And Roosevelt wasn't that kind of person anyway. He immediately declared unconditional war with Japan. Japan had to surrender unconditionally. But finally, Hitler makes an enormous strategic error. And as we've talked about a bunch, a couple of days after Pearl Harbor, he just goes ahead and declares war on the U.S., thinking that's inevitable. And that allows Roosevelt to declare war on Germany, which he always saw as the main foe anyway. So Pearl Harbor, in retrospect, as bad as it was, it could have been so much worse. And it also drew the U.S. finally into World War II. And Churchill, for one, later said that he had his first good night's sleep after Pearl Harbor that he'd had in years, because he knew once the U.S. was involved in World War II that Germany and Japan would be defeated.